Today, I invite you to dive into the deepest and least studied layers of the history of ancient Greece to reveal to you a world that is much more complex, surprising, multifaceted, and sometimes even shockingly different from what we are used to seeing on the pages of school textbooks and popular essays. We will intentionally leave out the well-known facts about democracy, philosophy, mythology, and classical art, and instead focus on 5 unique, sometimes very controversial practices that reveal hidden facets of ancient society, its complex social mechanisms, everyday life, mentality, and collective fears. These practices are not just curious. They demonstrate how the ancient Greeks solved their deepest problems, built their unique society, interacted with each other in the face of constant challenges, and understood their place in the world, creating a civilization full of unexpected details, deep contradictions, and not always obvious moral dilemmas. We explore not just dry historical facts, but also their social, psychological, economic, and philosophical underpinnings, revealing the true, fuller, and more authentic face of the ancient world. The first was the practice of ostracism, the profound paradox of democratic protection through exile, its socio-political dynamics, social psychology, and procedural nuances in the context of Athenian democracy. At the very heart of the democracy that flourished in Athens, this great polis that became one of the greatest intellectual and political innovation centers of the ancient world, lay a mechanism that, from the point of view of modern legal consciousness and political ethics, may seem to us surprisingly authoritarian, cruel, or even paranoid. Ostracism. This unique procedure, introduced at Athens by the great reformer Cleisthenes around BC, after the Athenians had expelled the tyrants with great effort and established the long-awaited democratic system, was designed with one but vital purpose in mind: to protect the young and still extremely fragile democracy from the threat of tyranny, a return to the one-man despotic rule that the Athenians hated most of all, and from which they had so hard to get rid. They remembered well the bloody and humiliating times of tyrants like Pisistratus and his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, and were ready to take any measures to prevent their return or the rise of new tyrants. Ostracism became a kind of preventive vaccination against dictatorship, allowing society to breathe out, relieve the accumulated internal political tension, and prevent civil war or usurpation of power by temporarily removing a potentially dangerous, excessively influential figure from the political life of the city, but without his physical destruction, deprivation of civil rights, or confiscation of property. It was a unique instrument of public self-preservation, developed with extraordinary foresight for its time, although, like any political system, it had its inherent shortcomings and could be abused. The mechanism of ostracism was unique, well thought out and relatively democratic in its essence, but it had very serious consequences for the individual, affecting his reputation, political career, and social position. The procedure began annually, at one of the regular sessions of the People's Assembly, Ecclesia, which was usually held in midwinter or early spring. The citizens were asked a single question: should ostracism be carried out this year? If the majority of the citizens present voted yes, usually by raising their hands, then 2 months later, usually in March, a special vote was held in the main square of Athens, the Agora. This was not a trial in which a person was accused of a specific crime, which required ironclad proof of guilt, a thorough investigation, and a hearing of the defense, as happened, for example, in a jury trial, Heliae. It was more of a political referendum on a potential threat, a kind of collective expression of public discontent, fear, apprehension, or even envy, based on public perception of an individual rather than on strict legal facts. Each citizen who had the right to vote, only free men who had reached the age of 18, born of Athenian parents, that is, full Athenian citizens, took a potsherd called an ostrakon, from the Greek ostrakon, a potsherd on which one wrote or scratched, and scratched on it the name of the person he thought should be banished from the city for 10 years. The reasons for choosing a particular name could be extremely varied and deeply personal, often unspoken. Some sincerely believed that a certain politician had become too influential, charismatic and popular, that his power could undermine the principles of democracy, turning into tyranny. Some feared his personal ambitions, excessive wealth, or desire for personal power, seeing this as a threat to collective governance. Others could simply vote against a personal enemy, a political opponent, or under the influence of gossip, rumors, demagogic appeals, and propaganda that were actively spread in the agora and in various public places, shaping public opinion. Ostracism could be a tool for expressing collective envy of someone else's success, a person's ability to stand out, or simply a way to get rid of an unpleasant but legitimate figure who was annoying with his position or behavior. The voting process itself was a massive, noisy, and very spectacular event, attracting a huge number of people. A specially fenced area was set up in the agora, where tens of thousands of citizens from all over Attica flocked. Sometimes the number of voters reached 30,000 people. Among them were illiterate people, for whom others wrote names on potsherds, which of course created opportunities for various manipulations and stuffing by political factions, who could prepare potsherds with the names of their opponents in advance, distributing them among their supporters. Archaeological finds confirm this. Excavations in Athens have uncovered piles of ostraca with identical handwriting, clearly indicating such organized campaigns and attempts to influence the outcome of the vote. After the votes were counted, if one person collected at least 6,000 ostraca, this was the quorum required for expulsion. If no one collected that many, the ostracism did not take place. He was ostracized. He was given 10 days to pack his things and leave the territory of Attica, the central part of the Athenian state, including Athens and the surrounding lands. The most striking and unique thing about ostracism is its consequences and their fundamental difference from the ordinary exile of criminals, which was a punitive measure. The exile did not lose his property, his civil rights were fully preserved, his family remained in Athens intact and under the protection of the law, and, most important, at the end of the 10 years, he could freely return to the city. With all his civil rights, his former status and reputation restored, as if nothing had happened. It was not a punishment for the crime committed, nor was it a final exile or banishment for life. It was rather a cooling-off measure, a forced political pause, designed to give society a respite from the excessive influence of one person, lest he should become a tyrant and destabilize the democratic order. For an ambitious and influential politician, however, exile was a severe blow, a loss of face, reputation, long-standing influence, and of course, the opportunity to participate actively in the political life of the polis for a full decade. Among the most famous victims of ostracism were such great figures as Themistocles, the hero of the Battle of Salamis, who played a key role in the victory over the Persians, but whose growing power, immense wealth, and perhaps arrogance began to arouse fear among his fellow citizens. Aristides the Just, known for his impeccable honesty and integrity, but also ostracized, perhaps because of his undue influence, or, as legend has it, because his constant justice had become boring to the Athenians. And Cimon, an outstanding general, son of the famous Miltiades, who was exiled on charges of sympathizing with Sparta. These examples demonstrate that ostracism could be used both as a fair instrument against potential tyrants and as a powerful weapon in the hands of political opponents to eliminate unwanted competitors and strengthen their faction. Ostracism shows the Athenians' deep distrust of any form of absolute or excessive power, even if it was obtained legally, and their readiness for radical, sometimes even absurd measures to preserve their freedom and democratic political system. Ostracism is a clear indication of how much the Athenians valued their democracy, how actively they fought for its survival in the face of constant internal and external threats, creating a unique precedent in the history of political systems. This practice highlights the uniqueness of Athenian political thought, which was prepared to sacrifice the temporary freedom of one to ensure the long-term freedom of all, and serves as a reminder of the complexity, diversity, and sometimes cruelty of ancient democracy, where even the popular will could be used to deprive someone of freedom, albeit temporarily, in the name of the highest good, preserving the state system and preventing possible destabilization. The second practice was ancient Greek fast food. We will consider culinary realities of everyday life, the gastronomic side of antiquity, economic factors, and the social role of street food. When we imagine the culinary side of ancient Greece, our imagination, as a rule, draws pictures of lush symposia, solemn feasts, where aristocrats, philosophers, and poets reclined on soft couches, sipped exquisite wines seasoned with spices, listened to the melodious music of lyres and flutes, recited poetry, discussed burning political issues, had profound philosophical conversations that could last for hours or even until late at night. These feasts were certainly an important part of elite culture, a symbol of their status, wealth, intellectual leisure, and social standing. But they were available only to a very small part of the population: the rich, the noble citizens, and their chosen guests. The vast majority of the inhabitants of the Greek city-states, whether farmers cultivating the poor, rocky soil, artisans toiling in their small workshops, dock workers, soldiers, slaves, or simply the poor living on the edge of survival, lived much more modestly. Their diet was simple, functional, aimed at satiety, maintaining physical strength for hard work, and was determined by the economic availability of products. It was for them, as for us in the modern world, that there was a developed system of fast food, fast, affordable, and nutritious street food, which was an integral part of everyday urban life, the economy, and social dynamics. The streets of Greek cities, especially in busy centers such as the Agora, Market Square in Athens, which was the heart of social and commercial life, or in major port areas such as Piraeus, the main port of Athens, were constantly bustling with people, the sounds of merchants and the varied smells emanating from the many shops, portable braziers, and temporary stalls. There was an atmosphere of lively trade and bustle, and street food vendors were everywhere, busily offering their wares. They offered hot meals that could be prepared quickly, conveniently purchased, and eaten on the go without the need for lengthy home cooking, which was often impossible due to the lack of a suitable kitchen, firewood, time, or money to buy it, or visiting expensive taverns, which were available mainly to wealthy citizens. It was a kind of ancient analogue of today's food stalls, mobile cafes, street food trucks, and ready-to-eat markets, where one could quickly satisfy hunger between errands, during work, or in between public duties. The basis of ancient Greek fast food was, of course, various types of flatbread. They were baked from different types of flour. The most common was barley, as barley was more productive, less demanding on the soil, and, therefore, cheaper than wheat. However, wheat or millet flour were also used, especially for higher quality or sweeter options. These flatbreads could be very simple, without additives, or enriched with various ingredients: olive oil, the main fat in the Mediterranean diet, honey, sesame, goat or sheep cheese, as well as various aromatic herbs, oregano, thyme, mint, which gave them different tastes, aromas, and significantly increased nutritional value. They were a versatile product, eaten like regular bread, dipped in sauces, olive oil or wine, or used as a wrapper, wrapping other foods in them, creating something like ancient sandwiches, rolls, or pitas with filling. For example, pieces of fried fish, cheese, vegetables, or bean paste could be wrapped in a flatbread, creating a quick and complete snack. A special delicacy were placunts, sweet flatbreads that were often served with honey and nuts or cheese, a kind of ancient quick dessert available to those who could afford a little extravagance. In addition to flatbreads, various types of legumes were actively sold on the streets, which were the basis of the diet of most of the population due to their availability, high nutritional value, and ability to be stored for a long time, which was important in conditions of limited resources. Lentil soup was especially popular, a thick, rich soup made from legumes, which was very nutritious, cheap, and easy to digest. Lentils, peas, beans, and broad beans were the main sources of protein for most Greeks, since meat was an expensive and rare pleasure, available mainly during large sacrifices when part of the meat of sacrificial animals was distributed among the population, or at feasts of the rich. Also offered were simply boiled or stewed legumes with olive oil, vinegar, onions, and spices. In seaside cities such as Athens, Corinth, Ephesus, and Miletus, fried fish was in great demand. It was often cooked right outside, on portable clay or metal braziers, using olive oil. Freshly caught fish, often small species, were quickly fried until crisp and served with a slice of lemon or a sprig of fresh herbs such as parsley or coriander. It was the most accessible source of animal protein for many city dwellers, especially sailors, dock workers, and soldiers. Snails could be found on the streets, collected after the rains or bred on special farms. They were considered a delicacy and were sold by weight, often fried or boiled, seasoned with garlic and herbs. The range of street snacks was complemented by various salted and pickled vegetables. Olives, which were an integral part of the Mediterranean diet and were grown everywhere. Cucumbers, onions, garlic, cabbage, which served as a wonderful addition to the main dishes or simply a refreshing snack. The vendors, called artopoli, bread vendors, ichthyopoli, fish vendors, or simply kapeloi, petty traders, shopkeepers, were an integral part of urban life and the economy. Their customers were people from all walks of life, but especially those who did not have the opportunity or time to cook at home. Workers, travelers, sailors, soldiers, slaves, whom their masters might give them money for food, and just townspeople who needed quick and inexpensive food. Ancient Greek fast food demonstrates the pragmatism, ingenuity, and adaptability of the ancient Greeks in their daily life and household. It was a world far removed from the idealized philosophical banquets and mythological banquet scenes, but much more real, widespread, and meaningful to the majority of the population. It debunks the myth of an exclusively highbrow and elitist approach to food in antiquity, showing that the majority of the population lived ordinary, mundane lives, where fast and affordable food played the same important role as in the modern world, emphasizing the universality of human needs and the adaptability of human society to economic realities and social conditions. This phenomenon was fundamental to the functioning of cities, providing food for huge numbers of people outside the home environment and without access to a private kitchen. The third was the Spartan Cryptia cruelty as the basis of military prowess, ruthless social control, and the maintenance of the hegemony of the Spartan state over the enslaved population. Sparta is a name that still conjures up images of unyielding warriors, unparalleled discipline, laconic statements, and an iron will. The Spartan system of education, known as agoge guidance education, was one of the most severe and totalitarian in human history. It aimed to create ideal soldiers, absolutely devoted to the state, devoid of individuality, and ready to make any sacrifice for its well-being and security. This system began almost from the very birth of the child. A weak infant could be thrown off a cliff, and a surviving child, already at the age of 7, was taken from the family and began a collective upbringing aimed at forming a warrior. However, behind the veil of legends about Spartan valor and courage, their invincibility and self-sacrifice, there was one of the darkest, cruelest, and little-known practices, cryptia, from the ancient Greek word krypteia, which means secrecy or secret matter, as well as secret passage. These secret trials were not just part of their training. They were a fundamental tool for maintaining ruthless social control over the vast enslaved population known as helots, and for ensuring the hegemony of the Spartan minority, who lived in constant fear of rebellion. The root of the cryptias lies in Sparta's unique demographic, social, and political structure, which was anomalous for the ancient world. The Spartiates, full citizens who constituted the military elite, were a tiny minority. Their numbers, according to various estimates, never exceeded 8,000 to 10,000 people, and by the Peloponnesian War they had significantly decreased. At the same time, the enslaved helots, the inhabitants of Messenia and Laconia, conquered by the Spartans and deprived of all rights, effectively in the position of state slaves tied to the land, constituted the overwhelming majority of the population. They outnumbered the Spartans many times over. Some historians, based on the accounts of ancient authors, suggest a ratio of 7 to 1 or even 10 to 1, and sometimes even more. The helots worked the land, providing the Spartans with food, and were obliged to give them half or even more of their harvest, thereby supporting the entire military system of Sparta. But they were completely disenfranchised, subjected to constant exploitation, humiliation, and even ritual beatings. Their enormous numerical superiority constantly gave rise to the Spartans' fear of a large-scale uprising that could destroy the Spartan state from within. It was precisely to suppress this potential threat, to keep the helots in a state of constant fear, to prevent any consolidation, to suppress the slightest attempts at resistance, and to demonstrate the absolute unquestioned power of the Spartans, that the cryptias were developed, which had the character of systematic terror and psychological pressure, and not just education. The Spartan system understood perfectly well that without constant, secret, and cruel control over the helots, their own existence and unique way of life would be impossible. Each autumn, usually after the harvest, when the helots were most vulnerable and work in the fields was at its lowest, under cover of night, the Spartan ephors, the 5 highest officials with enormous power and who enforced the laws and order of the state, would secretly select a group of young Spartans, usually from among the ephebes, teenagers in the final stages of the agoge, who were usually around 18 or 19 years old. These young men were considered the strongest, most resilient, smartest, and most promising. Essentially, they were the best of the best graduates of the Spartan school, the most prepared to perform the dirtiest and most responsible tasks. They were given minimal equipment, only a dagger or a short sword. They were strictly forbidden to take food with them, and sometimes even shoes, which was supposed to increase their endurance, the ability to survive in harsh, hostile conditions, develop stealth and self-sufficiency. Their task was to go into the Messenian countryside, where the Helots lived, and survive there, hiding from any human sight during the day so as to remain invisible and elusive, and to provide their own food, often by stealth theft from the Helots so as not to depend on outside sources and to demonstrate complete autonomy. But the main, most terrible and defining part of the Cryptias was the tracking down and killing of Helots. This was done under cover of night secretly, without noise, so as not to cause panic among the Helots, or, even worse, a mass uprising. The goal was not random victims or simple intimidation, but the strongest, youngest, bravest, most influential or potentially dangerous Helots who could lead a rebellion or were capable of organizing resistance. Thus, it was a targeted liquidation of potential leaders and the most active elements among the enslaved population. Such killings were not simply acts of violence. They were state-sanctioned and were acts of state terror disguised as training. The youths were expected to kill without hesitation, without remorse, without any mercy, cultivating in themselves the cruelty and ruthlessness that were considered absolutely necessary for a Spartan warrior whose life was dedicated to domination and control. The famous ancient author Plutarch in his Lives mentions that the Ephors declared war on the Helots every year, so that these killings would not be considered a crime and would not defile the killers, thereby removing the moral responsibility from the youth and legitimizing the terror. The Cryptia served several critical purposes for the survival of the Spartan state and its militarized society. First, it was an extreme practical training, perfecting the skills of stealth, endurance, wilderness survival, navigation, weapon use, and, of course, the ability to kill in combat under the most adverse circumstances. Young Spartans learned to be autonomous, ruthless, invisible, able to operate alone or in small groups in hostile territory. Second, and perhaps most importantly, it was an instrument for the systematic suppression of the Helots. Periodic purges carried out by invisible assassins prevented the accumulation of too many strong and capable Helots who might mount resistance. The Cryptiae reminded the Helots of their disenfranchisement, of the constant threat to their lives, and of the Spartans' control over their lives and death, creating an atmosphere of constant fear, submission, and disunity that was absolutely necessary to maintain their rule and prevent any organized resistance. For the Spartans, this practice was not simply an initiation or a rite of passage into adulthood. It was a vital element of their security and a way of preserving their unique militarized way of life, which depended entirely on the labor of the enslaved population. This practice is one of the darkest stains on Spartan history, revealing the true cost of their legendary military prowess and showing the brutal and inhumane lengths to which the state was prepared to go to maintain its power and stability in the face of constant internal threats. The Cryptiae vividly demonstrate how deeply fear and the need for total control can shape even the most revered and seemingly heroic military systems, stripping them of their humanity in the name of survival and dominance. Fourth were the ancient Greek public libraries. The revolution in access to knowledge, the cultural enrichment of society, and the formation of the intellectual environment in the Hellenistic period. When we think of ancient libraries, we usually picture gigantic, almost mythical repositories, such as the famous Library of Alexandria in Egypt, founded by the Ptolemies, or the library at Pergamon in Asia Minor, which rivaled Alexandria. These colossal institutions, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls, were the pinnacles of the intellectual world of their time, centers of science, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, grammar, and literary creativity, where the greatest minds of antiquity worked. Their primary function, however, was to collect, systematize, copy, and study texts for scholars, rulers, and a small elite. Access to them for the average person was extremely limited. if possible at all, and required special status, recommendations, or membership in learned societies. But in parallel with these grandiose projects, in ancient Greece and the Hellenistic world more generally, especially during the Hellenistic period, which began after the conquests of Alexander the Great, when Greek culture and language, the Koine, spread throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East, from about BCE and lasted for about 300 years. Much more modest, but no less important public libraries began to appear and develop, intended for a wider audience. This was a real breakthrough in the history of education and literacy, and had enormous significance for the development of Greek culture and civil society. Until then, books, that is, scrolls of papyrus or parchment, were incredibly expensive and rare. Their production required significant resources and labor. Papyrus had to be imported from Egypt. Egypt's monopoly on papyrus made it extremely valuable, and parchment made from tanned animal skins was expensive due to the complexity of production. Personal libraries were therefore the exclusive privilege of very wealthy families, aristocrats or philosophers, who collected private collections for their own use and for the education of their students in boarding schools. With the advent of public libraries, the situation began to change radically, making knowledge more accessible. Of course, public in the ancient sense did not mean complete and universal access, as in a modern library. One had to be literate to read, although the literacy rate was higher than in earlier periods, and have the leisure time to visit, which for a working person was certainly a luxury. Nevertheless, it was a huge step forward compared to the complete lack of such access for most citizens. These public libraries were not gigantic structures or separate monumental buildings like those of Alexandria or Pergamon. They were often located in existing public spaces. Gymnasia, places for physical exercise and general learning that also became centers of intellectual life and places for philosophical discussion. Near temples in Stoa, covered colonnades in the agora where people gathered for socializing, trade, and leisure, or other public buildings financed by wealthy citizens or city funds. For example, in Athens, the famous public library located in the Ptolemaic Gymnasium, founded with the support of the Egyptian Ptolemies, testifies to the spread of this idea. These libraries contained scrolls with the works of great Greek poets such as Homer, Iliad and Odyssey, and Hesiod, Theogony, Works and Days, with tragedies of the great playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, comedies of Aristophanes, works of historians Herodotus, history, and Thucydides, history of the Peloponnesian War, as well as philosophical treatises of various schools, from Plato and Aristotle to the Stoics, Epicureans, and Cynics. These places became important centers of intellectual life for citizens who sought education, broadening their horizons and joining the rich cultural heritage of their civilization. People could come to these libraries to read scrolls that interested them, or to study texts that were necessary for education or political activity. If they did not have the means to buy or own scrolls, they could have free access to them here. Often, libraries employed specially trained scribes, called grammarians or bibliographers, who could, for a fee, copy a text for a visitor. This was expensive, but cheaper than buying a ready-made scroll. Or the visitor himself, if he had the necessary writing skills and his own materials, papyrus or parchment, could copy part of the scroll to have his own personal copy. Moreover, public readings were often held in public libraries, where specially hired readers recited texts aloud. This was especially important for those who could not read, and this was the majority even among free citizens, since universal education was not the norm, although it was encouraged, or for those who preferred to perceive information by ear, which was quite common practice in the oral culture of antiquity, where reading aloud was the norm even for oneself. Public readings also contributed to the spread of literacy, cultural enlightenment, and the creation of a general intellectual atmosphere by stimulating discussion and exchange of opinions. The emergence and development of public libraries testifies to the growing desire for education and cultural development in Greek society, not only among the elite, but also among a wider citizenry, which would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. They played a key role in the formation of an educated civic environment where ideas could freely circulate, be discussed, developed, and disseminated, contributing to the development of rhetoric, philosophy, and political thought. Although their holdings may have been modest compared to the royal libraries, Their contribution to the spread of literacy, the development of critical thinking, and the maintenance of a rich literary and philosophical heritage was invaluable. These public libraries were the forerunners of modern public libraries, demonstrating that already in antiquity there was a deep understanding of the value of shared access to knowledge and the importance of education for all who sought intellectual and spiritual growth. They became places where democratic ideals and cultural development truly met, allowing citizens not only to actively participate in political life, but also to deepen their inner world through free access to the wisdom of their ancestors, which contributed to the flourishing of civil society and the maintenance of the intellectual leadership of Greek civilization for many centuries. And the last practice was the role of hetera in ancient Greek society, intelligent, cultured, and independent companions, surpassing stereotypes, their social status and unique socio-cultural function. The traditional idea of women in ancient Greece, especially in classical Athens, is often reduced to the image of a common-law wife, whose life path was strictly limited to housework and childbearing. She had no political rights, could not participate in public life, her exit from the house was strictly regulated, and communication with men outside the family circle was minimal, if allowed at all. Her world was limited to the gyneceum, the women's half of the house, where she supervised the slaves, raised the children, and did needlework and weaving. She was the keeper of the hearth, but not a public figure. However, within this strict social norm, there was a special and very influential class of women, known as hetera, ancient Greek hetera, whose role in ancient Greek society was much more complex, multifaceted, and significant than the mere prostitution with which they are sometimes mistakenly identified. They were not simply courtesans, they were cultural and intellectual companions who played a unique and irreplaceable socio-cultural role in the life of the polis, especially in its elite circles. The word hetaera literally translates as companion, girlfriend, or comrade, and this name perfectly reflects their social functions and status, which was fundamentally different from that of ordinary prostitutes, the so-called pornai, who were either slaves or women of the lowest social status. Unlike respectable citizens, hetera received an excellent, comprehensive education, often much deeper and more extensive than even many men of their time. They were taught not only the basic feminine arts, but also music, playing various instruments such as the lyre, flute, oles, cithara, cymbals, dancing, singing, and a much wider range of intellectual disciplines. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech and argumentation, poetry, reading and writing, literature, philosophy, history, etiquette, and, what was especially valued, the art of dialogue, wit, and the ability to maintain intellectual and deep conversations on a wide variety of topics. They were well informed about political events, cultural news, philosophical debates, the latest trends in art and literature, which made them extremely interesting and sought-after conversationalists in the circles of aristocracy, politicians, philosophers, and artists. The main venue for their social interaction and demonstration of talents were symposia, men's feasts that were not just banquets, but important cultural, intellectual, and political events, where philosophy, politics, literature, art were discussed, and various entertainments and friendly conversations took place. Ordinary common-law wives were not allowed to attend such events. Their presence was considered indecent and unacceptable in a male space. But heterae were an integral part of them. It was here that the hetera demonstrated their talents. They played music, danced, recited poetry, participated in philosophical discussions on par with great thinkers, made jokes, maintained subtle intellectual communication, and often became muses for poets, philosophers, and artists. Unlike ordinary wives, the hetera had considerable freedom of movement and communication. They were allowed to freely associate with men from high society, attend public places, for example, festivals, social events, even sometimes trials like Aspasia, own their own property, manage their finances, and lead a relatively independent lifestyle, which was completely unavailable to most Greek women. This independence often allowed them to accumulate significant wealth, which further strengthened their position. Some hetera achieved great wealth, influence, and even political significance, becoming not just companions, but real figures of power and influence, able to influence public opinion and even political decisions. The most striking example is Aspasia of Miletus, the companion and, in fact, common-law wife of the great Athenian leader Pericles in the 5th century BC, from about BC until his death in BC. Aspasia was famous for her extraordinary intellect, her profound knowledge of rhetoric and philosophy, and her eloquence. Her house in Athens was not just a home, but a real intellectual center, where such great minds as the philosopher Socrates gathered, who, according to some ancient accounts, himself learned the art of rhetoric and dialogue from her, and even Plato in his dialogue Menexenus attributes to her the authorship of the famous funeral speech of Pericles, which is probably an artistic exaggeration but emphasizes her reputation. Philosopher Anaxagoras, playwright Euripides, and other prominent political figures and thinkers of their time. Aspasia was not just Pericles' lover, but also his advisor, muse, and her influence on his political decisions and the public life of Athens was so significant that she even became the object of slander and accusations of atheism and pandering, which paradoxically only confirms her real power and role in society, since such accusations were usually brought against very influential and prominent figures. Other famous hetairai, such as Phryne, the century BC, famed for her extraordinary beauty, were not only muses for great sculptors. She is said to have posed for Praxiteles for his famous statue of Aphrodite of Cnidus, the first nude goddess in Greek art, and for the great artist Apelles, but also very wealthy and independent women. Phryne, for example, offered to rebuild the ruined walls of Thebes after their destruction by Alexander the Great, which speaks of her enormous financial means and social influence, as well as her patriotism or desire for public recognition. Hetairai were allowed to engage in commerce, own land and houses, enter into transactions, inherit property, which gave them economic independence unavailable to many other women, and allowed them to be not just objects, but active participants in the economic life of the polis. The role of hetairai in ancient Greek society was multi-layered and complex. They provided men not only with intimate services, which of course was part of their activities and a source of income, but also, no less importantly, with intellectual communication, cultural enrichment, emotional support, and even political advice, which they could not receive from their legal wives due to strict social restrictions. Their existence reveals a more complex and multifaceted picture of the position of women in ancient Greece, showing that even in the context of strict social norms and a patriarchal society, there were niches that allowed some women to achieve exceptional independence, education, wealth, and significant influence on society and politics. They were not just women of easy virtue, but often the cultural and intellectual elites of their time, forming an important part of the social, cultural, and even political life of the ancient Greek city-states, contributing to the flourishing of art, philosophy, and rhetoric, and providing men with that part of life that was closed in their own homes. Thus, ancient Greece, the cradle of Western civilization, is revealed to us in a new, more complex, deeper, and less familiar way. These 5 practices, ostracism as a unique and paradoxical mechanism for protecting democracy through temporary exile, the ubiquitous fast food as an integral part of the daily life of ordinary citizens, reflecting the economic realities and needs of the urban population, the grim and brutal Spartan crypteia as the basis of their military system, ruthless social control, and the maintenance of hegemony over enslaved helots, the emergence of public libraries that made knowledge available to a wider population and contributed to cultural enrichment and the formation of an intellectual environment. And finally, the multifaceted role of hetairai as intellectual, cultural, and independent companions who transcended stereotypes and played a unique socio-cultural role, show how deep, complex, and contradictory this ancient world was. It was full of paradoxes, complex social decisions, unique phenomena, and profound moral dilemmas that still amaze us and make us think about the nature of society, power, human relationships, and the price of progress, confirming that history is always richer and more complex than it seems at first glance, and that even the most famous civilizations hide many unknown depths waiting to be discovered.